Good morning. Today is December 21st, 2024. It is a Saturday, and it'll probably be my last video I'll make for this year. And of course, my volume has not been there. I forgot to say this is John Adamson, the Rehab and Documentation Guru. I wanted to relate a little bit of a story to you related to me by my daughter, who happens to be a nurse. She's been a nurse for about 2.5 years now in a hospital setting. And when I heard it, it made me reflect back over my career and perhaps instances where I acted like the players in her story. So she is in a step down unit. In case you're not familiar with that term, it is the step down from the ICU. So you are still getting patients that are more fragile than the typical inpatient acute patient, but don't need the mostly one-on-one or one-on-two care that ICU setting has to provide. So these are patients that have a lot of complexities. They have a lot of drips. They need to be monitored closely. And she, for the most part, has enjoyed a lot of aspects of her job. But one thing that she has not enjoyed is sometimes her relationship with her coworkers, who sometimes don't act in a very kindly way. And this particular incident happened this week and it involved a PT and an OT. And so, anyway, when she told me the story, at first I thought, how dare they? But then I thought, did I ever act that way? So, the long and the short of it is, she had been dealing with a very difficult patient with some cognitive, but a lot of behavioral issues, who also had a lot of medical needs. And the patient had done things behaviorally that would, even though nursing would go in and clean him up immediately after he did stuff, he would revert right back to his activities that would make him a mess. And I'll just leave it to your imagination what that mess might look like. Uh, and that is the situation that this PT and OT walked in on. So both of them are young therapists, and they walk in and they see this patient rather disheveled, unkempt, and they assume, without going to the nurse, that this patient has been neglected by the nursing staff. Now, I know my daughter. My daughter is a perfectionist. She is extremely compassionate and mindful of her care of her patients. So the to be accused of, which is what ended up happening basically to her face, is that she had been neglectful of this patient who literally they'd just been in nursing and just been in to clean him up, and so this PTOT come in and they are not kind, and they start taking control of the situation, taking control. And they also end up calling the doctor, which my daughter, who had been seeing this patient for multiple hours at this point of the day, had already done about this patient's behaviors and status. So they assumed that, it was her causing the problem without consulting, as you should collegially, with her. And then to make matters worse, this same PTOT grouping went to another patient's room who happened to be a patient of my daughter's. And she went into that room and she was observing what they were doing just to glean, how did the patient do with them? Because she had to chart on this patient. And she also wanted to see, like, truly what the patient's functional status was. And one of the therapists turns to her and says, "May I help you?" Just like that. So my daughter relates this story to me, and of course, as a father, the ire is rising within me. I am Scotch Irish, by the way. So I wanted to be there to give these young buck therapists a piece of my mind, since I've been practicing in healthcare longer than they've been alive. But I realized in what she was relating to me that there's a very strong likelihood that I maybe had acted the same way towards nurses in the past. And I bring this up to my general audience, which is generally rehab, because I think a lot of times those of us in rehab, depending on what setting we're working in, may assume that nursing is missing a lot of stuff. Now, granted, I spent a lot of my time working in the skilled nursing facility area. And so you are dealing with a lot of LPNs. And unfortunately, in skilled nursing, a lot of LPNs are pushing pills throughout the day to patients, and they don't really have a lot of time, or they don't take the time. But sometimes they just don't have the time to properly assess and treat as a nurse would their patients. And so they're pushing pills all day and not really eyeballing the patient as they should be. And it's not necessarily their fault. And I look back in my career and I think, how many times was I like this PT and OT with an attitude that somehow nursing had missed it and I had determined all the problems and I acted snootily towards nurses? And it's probably more than once. And so anyway, I guess my urging to you is this, simply my message is that I understand, and as therapists, sometimes we do get a fairly high level of education, right? So obviously, PTs now have to get the DPT. OTs are moving towards OTD exclusively. I don't know how soon that's going to happen. I think I saw AOTA was hoping for next year. I don't know if that's the case nationally. OTs, correct me if I'm wrong. Speech is even talked about having entry-level doctorates. That is a lot of education and more than the typical nurse has to get, right? And the idea is once you get that doctorate behind your name, you are a doctor, right? And you're told by your professors, call yourself doctor. And you're encouraged by your professional organizations, call yourself doctor. And that may lend itself towards being less receptive to the messaging that's provided to us by other clinicians who don't have to get their doctorate. And that is a wrong mindset. And also going into situations which often therapists do, depending on the healthcare setting you're in, where we don't know the whole picture. Now, we're fairly observant lot as therapists. We can walk into a scenario and we can see a lot of things and we can make assumptions related to that. But we don't know the whole picture. You can't. Perception isn't always the fullness of reality. Perception is based on reality, but it's not always the fullness. And so what I'm encouraging you to do is remember, you've got a whole team of healthcare workers working with your patient. You don't know all things. And lastly, but most importantly related to that, you need to be compassionate towards those you work with in the healthcare setting. And I look back at young buck John Adamson, and I realize I was a cocky jerk sometimes, and thankfully age has reminded me, and hearing more stories like my daughter's has reminded me to not be that cocky you know what, and to really listen to other people and to be collegial with my fellow healthcare coworkers who really are there to give the same kind of care generally that I am. They want the best for the patient. Now, are there bad apples out there? Absolutely. Absolutely. There are bad apples. But we can still try to be collegial with them, and they may still bring some value to that healthcare interaction for the sake of the patient, because it's not all about us. It's not about us showing a one-upsmanship that we're that much smarter, better, etc., than the other healthcare worker. So anyway, going into this holiday season, especially since I know some of you therapists are going to have to work during Christmas and Christmas Eve. I hate that for you. That's where healthcare is today. But obviously, there's going to be a lot of people that are necessary during Christmas, like nurses, for instance. Remember to show them compassion. All right, somebody, sorry, sorry guys, it's intermittently cutting off. Here, let me do. Any internet person, and obviously my channel's not big and I don't have a big audience, but any person that has a channel on YouTube is going to come across as snobby. So I agree with you. Do I give off snobby vibes? Yes, I can. Um, Although I would say that a video online persona is generally not going to be exactly the same in interactions. I mean, I don't dictate, you know, didactic information like this to people with whom I speak and I work with. So there's definitely a difference. And so, but yeah, I have been snobby. I am a smart guy. I am not coy about that. But I also recognize I have a lot to learn. And even though I started this channel, it was like 2014, I think, when I started the Rehab and Documentation Guru. So it's been a while. I started that with thinking I had a lot to say about documentation and rehabilitation. And while I had some things to say, I've learned a whole lot since then, especially in the area of documentation as it relates to multiple fields, even outside of rehab. And I've realized more and more, the more I know, the more I still need to know. And so, anyway, I appreciate Maryland cannabis. Um, Maybe I need to smoke some, right? So I come across as a little bit more chill. So anyway, appreciate that word. Anyway, again, last video of 2024, I plan to bring back interviews after the first of the year. We've just had a lot of illness in the family. I had a son who ended up in the hospital for 8 days. He's my very disabled child. He had double pneumonia, and so that put a hold on a lot of things. And today, because my daughter is working Christmas Eve and Christmas as a nurse, we are celebrating Christmas. So I'm getting ready to go in and we'll be gathering for some little things that we're going to do before opening gifts. So anyway, if I doubt I'll make another video beforehand, but if I do not, a Merry Christmas to you and hope you're doing well, to you and your family.